All right, welcome everyone to Crucifixion of the King of Glory. And we are on chapter 24 this particular week. And I think an interesting, although not necessarily pleasant, reading. Maybe it wasn't totally unpleasant. It's just, I was thinking about this one when we even started the whole reading group that we'll get to this and we'll have to have some, unusual conversations maybe for a reading group, because she goes into a lot of the medical details about what likely happened when Jesus Christ was crucified. Excuse me, I'll try not to cough too often, but every now and then I probably won't be able to avoid that. So before we go too far, let's do our practice of going once around to see if there's anything that folks were particularly impressed by, and want to make sure that we cover that before we finish up here tonight. So if you have anything that you'd like to make sure we talk about, please raise your hand, and we will either talk about that now, or we'll do that, make sure that we do that before we're done here today.
I thought one of the interesting topics was, I guess, is mentioned perhaps at the beginning of the chapter, and then kind of at the end of the chapter when they were talking about causes of death due to crucifixion. That essentially the theological take on this was that Christ literally gave up his life, that there potentially there was not really a physical cause of death. It was just that Christ gave up his life for the world. And I thought that was an interesting comment there.
I think that's I thought that was interesting also. And it makes sense, perfect sense, that his life could not be taken away. As someone who is omniscient and omnipresent, nothing that happened was a surprise, and he's more powerful than anyone or anything else. So from that point of view, he could only die if he sort of acquiesced to that. So I think that is an important piece, and I'm glad that you brought that up. Good. Others have particular specific things like that they want to make sure that we at least touch on while we're together. Okay, let's start tackling it from the front to the back. Okay, so crucifixion, the procedure and cause of death. So I thought that was pretty interesting, right from the first words of the second sentence, where she explains to us that the up and down beam of the cross was permanently affixed to the place of crucifixion. And it was only the cross beam that was attached then to those permanent vertical beams. I thought that was really interesting, and that they would often put multiple ones there. Remember, a lot of this has to do with Romans keeping power, making sure that everybody knows who's in charge, who's got the power, who has the power to crucify, who has the power to kill. That tends to help people to focus their thoughts when they're considering revolution or something else. So leaving those there like that all the time, the up and down beams, the vertical beams, that was always just a little reminder to folks that they could always be put up there if need be. So something to think about. Anyway, I found that very interesting, that was permanently there, and that was their practice throughout the empire. It wasn't just in Jerusalem, that they would have several of those vertical beams affixed into the ground outside of cities. So anyway, that I found that piece interesting. It makes perfect sense based on what we've been reading about Rome and their practices and so on and so forth. So, but that I thought added some value, at least for me. I found disturbing on that same page, 232, and kind of bleeds over into 233 about how the soldiers would sometimes play around with the people who were crucified. They'd hang them upside down or do strange things to them. And so that I found, but I guess, again, the idea here was humiliation. And so the soldiers saw people who were in this situation as those who needed to be humiliated. Just as we talked about how it was common that they would be mocked when they were on the cross. I guess this wasn't that uncommon either, that the soldiers would sort of not necessarily follow exactly the rules about nailing somebody to the cross. They may do it in a way that they found humorous, and I guess that was considered to be acceptable. Again, we're not talking about the 21st century human rights laws here. We're talking about a very different time and a very different set of laws and a very different sort of concept of punishment. Wasn't even that important, maybe, that someone was completely guilty, but that Rome would remain in power was the most important thing. She has this little conversation about this thing that they would put on the cross. I don't know if I would, sedile, I guess you might say. It's Sedile, like it was a seat sometimes or something that would sort of help prop the person up a little bit. But what it essentially did was just prolong the agony on the cross. So anyway, I thought that was interesting, and she reminded us that in Jerusalem, that at least the Jewish victims of crucifixion were always removed from the cross before sunset. So that's very interesting. Yeah, and probably they didn't use those little devices to prolong the death of those on the cross in Jerusalem because they wanted to have them dead before sunset and taken down. She also mentioned, again, these were mentioned previously, that crucified were always, at least on some level, elevated because they wanted people to see them because of the public nature of the spectacle, to emphasize shame, but also to emphasize Roman power. So yeah, I think important to keep in mind. Then she talks a little bit about the Roman nails and about how much damage they would do when they use those for to nail through someone's hands and feet. There's kind of a long conversation about that, and we'll talk about it in a bit. But I think that on one hand, the first time that I read this, I was kind of like, oh, this is a lot of detail. Is this really necessary? Like, as Orthodox Christians, we don't really like dwell generally on all of these graphic details. And of course, she knows that very well. You know, not only is she an Orthodox Christian, but she's was teaching for decades at a Jesuit institution, University of San Diego. And so she very well knows that. But I think this is really more of a scientific piece of the book. Knowing these things is not bad, but you won't find such details, such gory details, in the divine services of the church, which is the highest expression of the church's truth. In the book, okay, if we found that in the services, I think we would find that to be very foreign to our way of approaching these things. But in any case, I thought, at least I found it informative for sure. So the Romans used iron nails, as pretty much did everybody in the ancient world, and they were not fine instruments. They were very rough, and so they would cause great damage to someone when they were used to nail them to the cross, and that would just cause more pain for the folks when they were on the cross. All had probably been scourged in any case, and so they already had a lot of nerve damage, and this just added to that. We get to page 235, and she talks about the piercing with nails in some detail. So it's very, very interesting that we have kind of lost the meaning in English of excruciating, which literally means from the cross, right? So excruciating pain, when we're using that, it means something that was from the cross, and it's comparing that pain with the pain that Christ had there. So I myself had forgotten that was the etymology of that word. So when she wrote that, I sort of smiled about that. So we begin to talk about the hear the details of the person, what happens to them when they are crucified. Um, so I'll just read you a little piece. In addition to the torment from the nerve damage, that's from the nails, terrible muscle cramps quickly develop in the legs from the sustained bent position. The chest and shoulders also begin to feel tightness, and then severe spasms erupt from the fixed position of the chest and outstretched arms. So this is just some idea of what happens there when someone is crucified. She then talks about this terrible pain that comes from the nerves that have to do with the nailing of the hands and the feet to the cross. So it's more like a burning pain, apparently, uh, compared to lightning bolts traveling through the arms and legs. Um, when research was done on this, it showed that even morphine didn't provide relief for that. So some people may have some very small taste of this. This is not a direct comparison, but it's the only sort of comparison that I know. If you're a migraine sufferer, you may know this real quest to just be still and quiet and dark. That if you can be in that kind of a place when you have a migraine, it feels a lot better than when you're around a lot of noise, when you're around a lot of light, when you're around a lot of movement. And it even, when you have a bad migraine, it even hurts just to move yourself. Obviously, it's not, as I said, it's not a one-to-one comparison, but if you happen to have the blessing to struggle with such things, then you'll have some little taste of what she was talking about there. Okay, then we start to talk about these crucifixion experiments, which are really quite interesting and obviously happened a long time before institutional review boards existed at universities, where you have to bring your research and have it approved and show that it would not cause harm and so on and so forth. Let's see who's on the call. Okay, most of us are old enough to remember in university those psychological experiments that were meant to fool you. And anyway, those are like all illegal now, and they took away all the fun. I'm kidding. That's just the new rules are very strict about such things. But like when I went to school in the 80s, that was still totally legit. Like you could do these experiments where you were fooling the people who were there and instead of giving them complete information about what was happening. And the idea, of course, was not to fool the people, but to sort of show what is the real psychological response to things when you don't know the full story of what's happening. Anyway, crucifixion experiments wouldn't probably pass too many.
Did everyone else lose the sound?
Yes.
Probably my book must have hit something. So I was just saying that I don't think that the crucifixion experiments would pass too many of the institutional review boards at universities in our days. But these were done in the older days, and they tried to figure out exactly what was happening by essentially crucifying the college students without using nails. I'm sure a lot of professors would like to do that now, but couldn't. In any case, it didn't seem like it showed some began to help with some understanding of what was happening there. But I mean, if we're honest about it, it's still rather kind of unclear exactly what it was that killed people who were crucified, or rather, probably it was a combination of many different things, but not the same thing consistently. We learned from these experiments about extreme cramping that would take place. Okay, there was a lot of dehydration that went along with this, and of course that leads to cramping. This was often done in the sun, so that just made it worse. So that makes perfect sense. And not being able to move causes a lot of cramps too, because that lactic acid builds up, especially when you're sort of trying to hold yourself up. This showed some kind of information, but it wasn't a huge like revelation about exactly what it was that killed those who were crucified. Then we have this conversation about where were the nails actually nailed into Christ or to anyone, and her point was, and I think it's a good, like a legitimate point, that this part of the hand here is not strong enough to hold up the weight of the body. It's just not. There's nothing there. There's a few bones there, some cartilage, and that's it. So her argument is that even though Christ is often depicted with holes in his hands here, iconographically, it's almost certain that it would have been done here, where there's a lot of muscle and at an angle so that the thing kind of came out here, right? So it wasn't straight back; it was like this. Let's see, right? And that the nail would come out here and then go into the wood. And I mean, unfortunately or fortunately, well, unfortunately, unquestionably, they had a lot of practice. These guys knew how to do this. It wasn't like they're like, oh, let's see, how can we do it this time? They knew exactly what to do and how to do it. That was the practice indeed, was to, if you put the nails there, there was enough strength in that part of the hand, enough there that it would hold up the person as they were crucified, and as they suffered there and as they died. So at least that's the part that I found that was maybe the most interesting of all of that piece. Yeah. Then there's this little paragraph, not little, but interesting paragraph about where were Christ's feet. Like, if you pay close attention to the Orthodox iconographic depictions of Christ, he's never depicted with his feet one folded over the other one. But that's always the case in Roman Catholic iconography. Why they did that, I have no idea. And nobody seems to know. But she points out very nicely here on page 239, it just would not happen. It wouldn't happen because the Romans were not going to spend big money on these crucifixions, and so they had nails laying around, so they used nails. But they would have needed a big spike, like a railroad spike, in order to put it through, put one sort of spike, one nail through 2 feet, and then into the wood of the cross as well. So she points out that although that kind of started in the 11th century in the West, before that was never seen. It was never any concept that was the case. And it's not that important, but it's just, it's interesting because when the Catholic Church left the Orthodox Church, yes, it began to change the teachings of the church. And that makes sense. You cut yourself off from grace, then slowly but surely you'll start to allow errors in. But it wasn't just, errors like teaching like the filioque, these major theological errors. It was also these kind of iconographic things that were just not traditional, but there was no tradition to check it. Once you essentially make yourself, in your opinion, the arbiter of whether or not God, whatever, that God's will has to conform with yours, then all kinds of things can happen. So I just found that to be a little interesting data point, that just like this idea of we cross ourselves one way in the Orthodox Church and it's another way in the Catholic Church, nobody knows why. We know at the time that the church is split, that people cross themselves the same, both in the East and the West, and then sometime during those dark ages, quote unquote, after the split of the churches, then that reversed itself in the West. I mean, there are articles written about this, and you can make some good arguments, but in the end, nobody really knows for sure. But it's just a little deviation, and sometimes those little things can be informative for us, just like this iconography of the Christ's feet being crossed over each other in the West. She points out that surely that's not what the Romans did, and such iconography never existed until the time of the split of the churches. Okay, then in page 239 we come to the cause of death. So from a theological perspective, Jesus Christ, the Son of God, cannot have a cause of death because he died willingly. Okay, so that's what Ken was pointing out, and I think that it's a very important piece for us, and she talks about it several times. He allowed himself to die in order to defeat death by rising from the dead. So from the Gospel of John, for this reason, the Father loves me because I lay down my life, that I may take it again. No one takes it from me, but I lay it down of my own accord. I have power to lay it down, and I have power to take it again. So nothing could have taken his life, but he willingly consented to die. And of course, he did that for us, that he might take on all of our sins and make it possible for us to attain paradise again. So, after all of this conversation about this very important theological piece, and also the sort of physiological situation that is happening here when someone is on the cross, she begins to go through what are the three most likely scenarios that would cause someone to die from being crucified. And the first one is asphyxia, lack of oxygen. Well, really a buildup of carbon monoxide, essentially, because you can't apparently exhale well in that position. And slowly but surely, you would die of carbon monoxide poisoning and lack of oxygen. So each one of these has sort of its likelihoods and its unlikelihoods. What she points out is that none of the young men who participated in these pre-IRB crucifixion experiments had any trouble breathing. They didn't experience that at all. Now, even in those days, they wouldn't have scourged them before they put them on the cross for an experiment. So certainly it wasn't a one-to-one thing, but nonetheless, none of them at all had difficulty breathing. So that sort of, it doesn't say that that's not what happened, but it sort of weakens the argument about whether that's what it was that caused Christ or to die on the cross. So the second point that she makes, and now we're on page 243, is a heart attack or a ruptured heart. She says it's unlikely, but it can't be dismissed completely because broken heart syndrome has been reported and documented even among younger people who have experienced extreme stress. So entirely possible that was the case. Yeah. And then the last one is shock, traumatic shock, and hypovolemic shock. So she points out that those are two real possibilities, especially due to the low blood volume that Christ would have had because of dehydration and because he lost a lot of blood in the scourging. Remember, they normally expected someone to carry the crossbeam to their own crucifixion, but he couldn't do it. So they knew that they scourged everyone before they were crucified. That always happened. And they understood that if they sort of did it right, that would weaken the person, but not so weak that they couldn't carry the crossbeam. But they were apparently so rough with Christ that he was not able to carry that. And he lost a lot of blood, excuse me, from that crown of thorns. Anyone who's ever gotten a little, anything more than a scratch on their head understands that there's a heck of a lot of blood there. Your kid can, bump their head and you think that they've had some kind of major trauma, and it turns out it's just like a little scratch, but there's so much blood. So all parents have experienced that from once or twice, I guess, if they had a boy anyway. And so he lost a lot of blood. And so that seems to be where she leans the most, like as the most likely scenario, that from a physiological point of view, as we said, from a theological point of view, Christ gave up his life. But from a physiological point of view, she seems to lean most towards shock as the cause of death. So it's, yeah, and as I said, an interesting chapter from that point of view of, like, most of us probably don't think about the physiological details of Christ's death or the death of anyone who was crucified on the cross. And so I sort of went back and forth many times in my mind about this, like, is this a good chapter to have in this book? And in the end, I think that it is. I think it's informative for us. And because she keeps it kind of on the scientific side, and she's real clear about the theological reality that Christ could not be killed, he could only give up his life. I'd say overall, I find it to add value to our sort of knowledge and understanding of what's happening with Christ during this time. And as we begin to point ourselves more and more towards Holy Week, this probably was, at least for me, a helpful piece as I begin to think about these things and get myself ready for that. Because for those who are parishioners at our parish, you've surely over the years become completely, sick of hearing me say, Great Lent is going to pass very quickly. It's the first couple of days. Don't blink because we're going to be in Holy Week soon. And everybody laughs. And then we get the Holy Week and everybody's like, oh, Father Gregory, we're so sorry. Actually, they never say that, but I'm sure they think that. So in any case, Great Lent does pass very quickly, and we're getting ready to start on Monday. And everything pretty quickly starts pointing towards Holy Week, which makes sense because Great Lent is a preparation for Holy Week. Holy Week is a preparation for the Lord's resurrection. And it's two different Lenten periods for those who are not aware of that. It's not one big long one. It's the two periods. Great Lent itself ends on Lazarus Saturday Eve, right? Lazarus Saturday, it's already Holy Week. There's no time between them. You can't sneak a hamburger in between Great Lent and Holy Week. They flow from one into the other. But strictly speaking, it's two different Lenten periods. Great Lent to prepare us for Holy Week, and Holy Week to prepare us for the Lord's resurrection. So does anyone have questions, comments that they'd like to add to my sort of squeaky voiced monologue that we just wrapped up? Okay, would someone like to press the raise your hand button just to see if there's anyone who's still alive out there, conscious?
Yep. So
There's somebody. Okay, good, proof of life. That's great. Okay, excellent. Let's talk logistical stuff here just for a second. This will be our last Wednesday meeting. We're gonna switch over to Tuesdays, not next week. Next week we live in church. So there will be no meeting next week, but beginning then let's get out that calendar thing. So our next meeting will be on Tuesday, the 11th of March, and we will continue on Tuesdays. And I think our last one is the 8th, but it might be the 15th. I doubt it because although we could meet hypothetically on the 15th. Anyway, I'll look at the syllabus. I don't have it in front of me, but in any case, our next meeting will be on the 11th of March, and we'll cover two chapters at least, and that will be chapter 25 and 26. If you take a look at your book and see, we're 2/3 through, if you can believe it. So, any questions about logistical stuff? Any questions about Great Lent? Any questions about meetings? Same time, same channel, just on Tuesday nights. Okay. Well, please pray for me tomorrow. I'm sorry.
You updated that in our Google Calendar then as well?
Yes, I will. I have not, but I will.
Hey, Father, an unrelated question. When is liturgy on Saturday? 8 o'clock?
Yeah, 8 o'clock.
Okay.
We have 3 calendars, and trying to keep remember that sometimes it's at 9 and sometimes it's at 8. It's been just completely impossible. So we're just going to do 8 at 8 o'clock, 8 o'clock on Saturdays going
Okay,
forward.
thanks.
Otherwise, half the people are upset because they're early and half are upset because they're late.
So will they be offered at least the sound virtually as I sit here in Florida?
Saturdays?
Yes.
Yes, our stream actually, if you'd like to listen to an empty church, you could do this too. Every morning at 8 o'clock it comes on.
Excellent. Thank you.
You're welcome.
Hey, Father, I had a
Okay.
quick question. You
Yeah.
know, this chapter said that the cross was in 2 pieces,
Yeah.
but when Saint Helen discovered the crosses, how would that be then if the one piece was always left there?
I was thinking about that too. I think it's a great question. If they nailed people's feet to the cross, which they did, eventually they'd have to replace those things, right? Like at what point, I don't know, like how many times can you crucify somebody on that before you have to replace it? No idea. But it must have been time. Like that must have been it. Those were the ones that they just took them down and tossed them into the water or whatever where it was that she found it. So I think it's a good question, but I think that's the only logical answer, is that at some point you just can't keep putting these nails into the wood beams. You have to switch them out, even if it's once a year. So it must have been time to do that. That's my guess. I'm going to try to read more about that and see what I can find, but that's the only thing that kind of makes sense to me. So I hope that answers the question. Okay, any other questions, thoughts? Okay, please pray for me. Tomorrow I fly to New York. I have to clean out Archbishop Peter's room at the synod. Every permanent synod member has a room there, and that needs to be given up to another member now. So tomorrow I'll fly out there and clean it out, and then I will come back on Friday. On Friday evening. So in any case, that's where I'll be for these next couple of days. I should be totally reachable, but I will not be physically here in Michigan. Thank you everybody for I'm sorry. What's
Thank
that, Marlene?
Take care of yourself.
Just
Thank you. I'm trying. Thank you everybody. Let's pray and then we can say goodnight. It is truly meet to bless thee, the Theotokos, ever blessed and most blameless and mother of our God, more honorable than the cherubim and beyond comparable glorious than the seraphim, who without corruption gave us birth to God, the word, the very Theotokos, thee do we magnify. Okay, good night everyone. Take care.
Thank you.
Good night. Have a safe trip.
Good
Thank
night.
you.